I'm Doug Guthrie, and I'm with On Global Leadership and the Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University. And we're here to talk to you today about doing business with China. Today's China is a fascinating moment, and this is perhaps what we think of as the most important moment in U.S.-China relations in the last 30 years. And over the course of the next couple of podcasts, we're going to make the case that this is a key moment for U.S.-China relations, and again, maybe the most important moment since 1994, when Bill Clinton did the engagement policy. But we're also going to make a somewhat controversial claim that this is not only the most important moment for U.S.-China relations in the last 30 years, but Phoenix is ground zero for U.S.-China relations. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's the case, but I just want to be clear, this is a really, really important and exciting time. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through, over the course of several podcasts, what my own intellectual development and intellectual theory is with respect to this, but also how we've become deeply embedded in the Phoenix area with, not only I'm a professor at the Thunderbird School of Global Management at ASU, but I've also become closely tied with the Chinese Chamber of Commerce in Arizona. And, I think a lot about the relationships that are developing here. And so we wanted to get online and just talk to you about what's happening here, okay? So let me start with a little bit of a personal narrative. And for the most part, over the course of these podcasts, we're going to give you hardcore economic and sociological analysis, but I have to tell you a little bit of my story. And I'll get deeper into the story in our fourth segment, but I'll tell you the short version now. So I'm a kid who grew up in western Pennsylvania, a suburb of Pittsburgh. And I never imagined I'd be a China scholar. Who knew? I didn't really think about that. What I thought about is, I had a mom who dreamed very big for me, and she wanted me to be in politics and maybe be Secretary of State or something like that. I went to the University of Chicago as an undergraduate, and I wanted to study economics. Where else do you study economics except for at the University of Chicago in the 1980s, right? This is the land of Milton Friedman and neoclassical economic theory. Like, you want to study economics, go there. And so I did. And Chicago has pretty heavy requirements, and so you have to take language for 2 or 3 years. And I had a Taiwanese roommate. He was the son of a very famous Taiwanese scholar named Zhou Yunshu. And he said, "You should take Chinese, Doug." And I was like, no. I was in high school. I took German. I'm going to take German. It's easy. And he was like, "You're afraid." And trust me on this, all you parents in the room listening, you never say that to a 19-year-old. You tell a 19-year-old they're afraid, they're going to do whatever you tell them not to do. Or maybe that's what you tell them because you want them to do it. But in any case, I stood up to my Taiwanese roommate and said, "Okay, I'm taking Chinese." And so my second year at the University of Chicago, I took Chinese and I fell in love. I fell in love with the language. I fell in love with the literature. I fell in love with the history. And that happened to be the year, 1988 was the year I started studying Chinese. Spring of 1989, you'll all remember what happened. It was the Tiananmen movement. And so there I was, this young kid living in a very poor, small room in an apartment in the south side of Chicago, and I would run home every day and watch what Wu Kai-shi and Shen Tong and Cai Ling were doing to revolutionize their country. And I was all in at that moment. I was in love. And so at that moment I realized, I can't just be studying language in a language lab, I gotta go. And so I borrowed some money from my grandparents, bought a plane ticket and flew to Taiwan, spent a year studying in Taiwan, and there I was. I was just all in. I came back from Taiwan and I was a China scholar. So I wasn't just gonna study economics, I was gonna actually be at the forefront of studying what this rising, the most populous nation on earth, but still a really struggling economy. I mean, this is the early years of the economic reforms, just a decade in. And so, that I was all in. And so then I majored in Chinese language and literature, and then I went to the University of California, Berkeley, and studied economic sociology. And in 1994 and 95, I found myself in Shanghai doing research for a doctoral dissertation on the impact of foreign investment in China and joint venture relationships, and I can tell you about all that stuff later. But in any case, it was a very important moment in my life because I really realized that was 1994. That was the year of economic engagement under Clinton. And then I became a professor at NYU, and then very suddenly, as a young assistant professor at NYU, I was called by Paul Wellstone to help negotiate for China's entry into the World Trade Organization. And it was the greatest gift and the greatest, I was just living the dream, right? And so at that point, we helped China get into the World Trade Organization. I kind of went on with my career. I became a business school professor at NYU. And then I went on to, from being a business school professor, run executive education at NYU. I became the dean of the business school at George Washington University. I exited that job. And then I got a call from Tim Cook and Joel Podolny. And I went to be the head of Apple University in China. And from 2014 to 2019, I helped Apple navigate what it was doing in China. And it was such an important time. Oh my goodness. I think Apple, now the most profitable company and one of the most valuable companies in the world, they didn't see what was happening in the change of the Chinese economic dialogue and the Chinese relationship. And so I helped Apple navigate that time period. I came back, I had to get my family back, and we came back, and now I'm a professor at the Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University. And it is such an important time. This is the moment for U.S.-China relations. And I believe that, and I just want you all to know that I believe that. But it's such an important moment because we have to break the Washington-Beijing pundits' consensus. This is not about what do pundits in Washington and Beijing think anymore. This is about what local economic development is about. And so one of my areas of research when I study China right now is, everybody knows what's happening in the Beijings and Shanghais and Shenzhens of the world. They've all heard those places. Have you heard of a city called Zhenjiang? Have you heard of a city called Changzhou? Maybe you've heard of Zhengzhou because that's where Foxconn is located, but these are the important places of economic development. And so my research team and I at On Global Leadership, we spend a lot of time thinking about what local economic development is like and why China is the most effective capitalist economy in the world right now. So communist China, and forget about the word communism, but let's just call it as it is. Communist China is the most powerful capitalist economy in the world right now. And it will be the largest economy. So let me just be clear. We say communist China, and of course the CCP is the ruler of China, but communism, capitalism, all I want to be clear about here is China is the most effective capitalist economy in the world, period. It is so powerful what the Communist Party has built for the last 40 years. And so a lot of my work is about helping the world understand what has happened here. And so just to be clear about one thing, and some people in the United States might get upset about this, but when people talk about the difficulties in the U.S. economy, I want to go back to 1980 and Ronald Reagan and Milton Friedman and neoclassical economic theory. I'm a Chicago school economist. I understand what happened during this time period. And if you want to blame people for what's happened in the U.S. economy, you can't blame China for stealing our jobs. You have to blame neoclassical economic theory for creating the economic conditions that allowed corporations and encouraged corporations to pursue profits and plenty, right? And they pursued them in places like China and India. China has been the most effective at building the most powerful manufacturing supply chains in the world. And I've been watching this again for the last 30 years. I started watching it in the 1990s when I was doing my doctoral research. I started doing that research and then writing books about it. And then doing consulting, but also just advising companies on what was happening. And then ultimately I had a great seat at the table because Tim Cook and the Apple executives invited me in to really see what was happening on building the manufacturing supply chain. China has built the most powerful manufacturing supply chain in the world, bar none. This is not a story of cheap labor and the exploitation of cheap labor. This is a story about investment in building the most effective manufacturing supply chain in the world. And so when people talk about, well, we could just go to India because Foxconn built a plant in Chennai, they fundamentally misunderstand just how complex the manufacturing supply chain and what the investment in building that manufacturing supply chain has been. So there's a story here about how powerful that economic development period is and what it is that China has built, okay? We're going to get back into that in another podcast. But what I want to emphasize here is that we have to break the Washington-Beijing consensus. This is not about what do the pundits in Washington and the pundits in Beijing think about things. The most important thing about what's happening with U.S.-China relations right now are three issues. One, China is going to be the largest economy in the world, and I believe that. I'm convinced of it, and if you want to negotiate or debate me on that topic, you can, but it's very clear. We can argue about whether or not those growth statistics are in trouble because of the investment in real estate or the investment in other aspects of the economy that are wrong, but China has been investing in the manufacturing supply chain, okay? And so China is going to be the largest economy in the world. There's no question about it. The question is, what is our relationship with China going to be? And that's where I think we have a really interesting question because, again, we have pundits at the presidential level. So we got the Trumps and the J.D. Vances of the world, and then we have Bidens and Harrises. But I actually think this conversation needs to be taken away from capital to capital relations, so Beijing to Washington. And instead, we need to talk about economic development, right? So there's a really interesting story in my experience recently. When I came to Phoenix and I started thinking about all of my research on development of second and third tier cities in China, I spent a lot of time doing research with the core people who are developing the economy in China. And my key inspiration in this area is a scholar named Andrew Walter. And he wrote an article in 1995 called Local Governments as Industrial Firms. And in my opinion, this was an article that was so ahead of its time. He saw the future. He saw what the Beijing government was doing. And the Beijing government wasn't just an authoritarian dictatorship saying, we're going to be state-owned economy and you need to produce this, 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 this. That was the Soviet Empire. That's not China. What China did was they had 5-year plans, but they very quickly decentralized in terms of to push local economic development. And they put the economic development on the shoulders of the mayors and the directors of the bureaus of commerce in these local cities. So not long ago, I was out in Zhenjiang. And Zhenjiang is just a second or third tier city in Jiangsu province. And I was there and I was interviewing the director of the Bureau of Commerce in Zhenjiang, and I said, what are you thinking about? How are you thinking about economic development? And he talked about KPIs, key performance indicators. He talked about economic development. He talked about the development of industrial clusters. He talked about looking at Changzhou and seeing the ways in which they developed a presence in industrial clusters that they were admiring. And I was amazed because this guy was not a government official. This guy was a local government of industrial firms. Like, he was the key person who was thinking about his KPIs for the economic development of Zhenjiang. And so this is what I think China has done that's so brilliant, okay? Now, how does this relate to U.S.-China relations and breaking the mold of the Beijing-Washington consensus? Well, what it means is we need to think about local economic development. We need to think about local ties, right? We need to think about, so instead of focusing on Washington and economic development in this space, we need to think about sister cities, right? So anybody in this film know who the sister city of Phoenix is? It's Chengdu. Do you know who the sister city of Tempe is? It's Zhenjiang, right? And so these are the relationships that actually matter, right? The relationships that matter are not what do the pundits in Washington and Beijing think. More important is what do the mayors and local economic developers, and in China it's the case of the Bureau of Commerce, but in Phoenix I'm not even sure what that economic infrastructure looks like, but it's the people who are responsible for developing the economic infrastructure that builds the relationship, that builds flows of capital and flows of economic ties between the two areas, right? And so, yes, the United States, U.S.-China relations, critical point in the last 30 years. But why is Phoenix ground zero? Phoenix is ground zero because TSMC is here, right? So there's been an argument for TSMC developing investment and developing major fab sites outside of China. Where are they going to develop them? Well, they chose Arizona. They chose Phoenix, right? And so this is a key moment for thinking about the key issue of 1, U.S.-China relations, 2, U.S.-China-Taiwan relations, 3, the development of a manufacturing infrastructure in the desert, right? So I'm admiring what the leaders of Phoenix have decided. They've decided we're not just, trying to think about how do we build casinos and real estate in the desert. Instead, what we're thinking about is how do we build a manufacturing supply chain here? And they've solved the water issues. A lot of people who come at me talk about this question of how have they solved the water issues? All of the experts, and I'm not an expert on the geophysical issues of water, but a lot of people that I talk to have thought a lot about this. But this has also become a spot for, once you solve that problem, how do you build a manufacturing supply chain here? And my goodness, they're building some of the most intensive and important manufacturing supply chain fabrication systems in the most important industry in the world, arguably. The microchip industry might be the most interesting and important industry in the world, and here it is, right? And so this is a moment. We cannot be at loggerheads or in an economic Cold War with our largest trading partner. We have to be in collaboration. And so this is a moment. So I think it's just an amazing moment, and I'm so happy to be here as a professor at Arizona State University and the Thunderbird School of Global Management, and working with the Chinese Chamber of Commerce Arizona, and just thinking about these issues. Wow, this is such an interesting and powerful moment, and here we are. And so I hope you're all with me on this journey. I'm Doug Guthrie.